All right, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This week, no pops. Anyways, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David Boozer, where you get some of the best based on true Bigfoot encounter stories from the Pacific Northwest. And just so you know, when you email me about your encounters and you're from not from the Pacific Northwest, don't worry, no worries. As a matter of fact, I like to interview people from around the country. As a matter of fact, I haven't done any interviews in the last few weeks, and reason being was that I was working on some new software, working on updating the website. Been doing a lot of things. There's so many of you guys hitting the website now that I had to kind of upgrade that. So I would appreciate if you guys get over to the PacWest Bigfoot shop, grab yourself an awesome t-shirt or a coffee mug or a hoodie or whatever, and help kind of support the show there. Pretty soon, I'm also going to be able to offer Sasquatch coffee through the website here, so that's going to come out pretty soon, and you guys can grab some of that to kind of support everything that's going on here. Anyways, want to say and give a shout out to the I believe it's the Tupper family out here in Eastern Oregon, who were the winners of the last month's giveaway, and I hope you enjoy the extra little surprise that came in that package. So there's two things. As a matter of fact, a good friend of ours and fan here, Chris, has actually given us a little something extra that we could give away here on the old PacWest Bigfoot blog, and I'll tell you this real quick. It's 4:30 in the morning. Ha! Um, but this next month, I got a couple things for you as well, okay? So there we have it. If you want to enter to win in the monthly free giveaway, you just go over to PacWestBigfoot.com, PacWestBigfoot.com, and you can sign up where it says sign up or join the clan, okay? So let's clear the throat and get some coffee. Let's get ourselves around the fireplace or the campfire, and let's get ourselves ready for this week's PacWest Bigfoot encounter story. Bigfoot haunts a Cul De Sac in Washington State. I guess you could say it is a cul-de-sac, but in Marietta-Alderwood, Washington, my wife and I, plus a neighbor or two, have been visited a few times by Bigfoot at night. It was not too frightening, but there was a couple incidents where we did feel like moving had been an option. Here's what happened to us. King of the cul-de-sac. We moved in around the beginning of August to our new home in Marietta-Alderwood, Washington in 1990. My wife and I felt pretty proud to have such a nice home at our age. We were young, but we were already doing well for ourselves, fresh out of college. We made enough at that point to almost be out of college debt, surprisingly, and had enough in a year to use as a down payment we saved, so we bought a great little home at the end of a cul-de-sac type of street towards the edge of town, where the river separates a large forested area near where the Nooksack River runs into the sea and a river, and directly west was a reservation. It did not last, though, the honeymoon with the house, that is. It lasted a week when we started hearing some pretty strange sounds that led up to a couple sightings and a bit of a scary moment or two involving what we thought not possible. Bigfoot. My wife and I never believed in the stories of Bigfoot, and being native Oregonians before moving to Washington, well, we've heard the names and stories of Bigfoot or Sasquatch a million times growing up. But we never believed them, and the tales would go in one ear and out the other. But today, actually, it is just the opposite. When the conversation is started, our ears perk up and tune in, and that goes for the both of us. Due to our professions, though, we cannot dive into the conversations in public so much. Telling you this story now makes me a bit nervous, but we had to get it out. Like I said, we were the king and queen of the cul-de-sac for at least a week until that first night when something in the dark would scream again and again and again for nearly a half hour. Is it a crazy party over there? I have to admit, but at first we thought the screaming was some tribal singing or something like that coming from the reservation of the tribe across the river. We were wrong, of course, but at first it sounded like a lot like a woman chanting and yelling real loud. I remember we were sitting there watching television. I hate commercials, and when they come on, I mute them. Well, at that point, a commercial came on, I muted it, and my wife got up to freshen up our iced tea. It was in the middle of August, and it was really warm that evening, even for the rainy state of Washington, so we had our windows open. I thought I heard it too, but my wife called me to come to the kitchen, and she sounded a little worried. Through the kitchen window, we could hear what sounded more like a scream or bellowing of a woman after a couple seconds or so. We decided to head outside into the backyard to get a better grasp on the sound and where it was coming from. As eerie and weird as it sounded, we almost felt compelled to go out there to listen. Wah! It started out as a scream, but as the volume descended, it had a sound that was human-like. Maybe a woman in trouble or just screaming for fun. For a second there, my wife looked at me, and I at her, and wondered if it was some native ceremony or something. But as it continued to scream, it seemed to be coming closer to the house, and was in fact now near the edge of the river, on the opposite side. It was scary sounding, so much so my wife held her hands over her ears to stop from hearing it. After the third or fourth time they screamed or yelled or whatever it was, it stopped, and I told my wife it was over, and she removed her hands from her ears. For a few weeks it continued, and the conversation of what it really was started. The fence and the face. It was the last weekend of August when the bellowing, or better yet screaming, started up again after dying off for a week. This time it seemed to start at around 11 p.m. and lasted for about 5 to 10 minutes. After that, not a sound. My wife and I are night owls, so bedtime for us is not earlier than 11 or 12 at night. So we were wide awake to hear the screaming. Sunday morning came, and I was out mowing the lawn when one of my neighbors in the Cul De Sac, we had not met yet, came to introduce themselves and welcome us to the neighborhood. It was a rather normal conversation until I mentioned the screaming the night before. Dave sips coffee. It was as if I opened up a treasure trove of words for this guy. I'll keep his name out of it. He started asking me what I heard, and we carried on a rather awesome but long conversation that lasted nearly 30 minutes in my front yard about whatever it was. He mentioned Bigfoot before the conversation ended. I was fascinated for sure at what he believed the reason for the screaming came from, and he was matter of fact about what he thought it was too. It was nice to meet him, and even today we are friends and carry on some great conversations about this thing, in fact. However, after chatting with my wife when I was done mowing the lawn over lunch, I have to admit we laughed it off a bit. But he was right, and he was proven right later that night. That same day, actually, later that afternoon, we headed out for an early dinner. I remember it being Chinese food. I remember everything about that evening well, even today. When we got back home, after a couple other stops for some grocery shopping, it was just after dark. Like my wife says, it's better to go grocery shopping after you've eaten. It was not a scream we heard that grabbed our attention. It was clacking coming from out behind our house, loud clacking. We could hear it from the driveway. I remember Leslie looking at me funny, and we decided to take a look out back. We left the groceries in the back of the car and walked through the side gate into the backyard. Excuse me. It was dark, but we had lights on that illuminated most of the backyard up to the fence. That is when we caught eye shine. Whatever it was, later we would know it to be Bigfoot. It was literally at least 2 feet taller than our 6-foot fence. At first I thought I was seeing a bat or even an owl flying with brilliant red eyes, but it stopped, turned towards us, and looked right at us, and stood still. My wife practically fainted. She was not going to faint, but the gasp I heard from her as she darted behind me told me she felt completely afraid. And well, so was I all of a sudden, to be honest. It stood there, whatever it was, just out of the direct light, enough to only get eyeshine. But whatever it was literally 2 heads taller than that fence, and probably 3 heads taller than me. Before I could suck in my own breath for fear, it was gone. I blinked, turned, and we heard heavy footsteps head off towards the river. That started a conversation that would not end, even after we woke up for breakfast and out the door to head to work. Grunts and sticks. And a sip of coffee. A week or so passed, if I remember correctly, before anything else happened. The conversation continued of the red floating eyes, and not once, but a few times the wife and I caught each other staring out the back window, looking out into the dark. It was getting cooler as September came, and one night, later than usual, the screaming started up again. I woke my wife up, and we opened the window and stared out as whatever it was approached the back of the Cul De Sac again. This time, however, we got a decent glimpse of a large, 2-legged something or other as it passed under a light coming from someone else's backyard. The screaming stopped, but this thing or person was huge. I knew my neighbor was right at that point. Bigfoot exists, and this was one of them. I whispered to my wife, "I told you so," as we stared at this thing while it glided toward our home with its weird walk. Noticing this, we began to get rather nervous. But just as it seemed to be within 20 to 30 yards from our fence, it veered off down the river and back up the way it came. Next thing you know, we could hear what sounded like loud grunts and sticks hitting something like a tree or something made of wood. After a few minutes, everything went quiet. Not much happened for nearly 3 weeks after that. There was a moment outside one evening while taking out the garbage that I felt like I was being stared at. You know that feeling. Well, some of you might, but that was it until I saw this thing within feet of our backyard. Old Man River. The River Man, that is what some of the young native folks call this thing. I've heard them call this thing the River Man in other parts of the state before. My wife had a chance to hang with a friend from church who taught on the reservation one day. She said she had mentioned the happenings around the house, and a couple girls overheard and called it the Riverman. Personally, the animal is a monster of a thing, Riverman or no Riverman. So, October came, the second week of, and people already had the typical Halloween yard art strewn all over the place, even in our small neighborhood. What is, and was, funny about that later was the fact the monsters were real, and we would know near the end of that second week of the month. It all started without the screaming or crazy scary eyes in the night. Instead, it started with a crash. Our fence, in fact. My wife and I were sitting there, and crash we heard as the fence came crashing down in the backyard. It was just a small section of it, and it was not broken, just slightly twisted, laying on the ground. But looking out the window, we could see movement. My wife turned off the light over the sink, and we could see clearly into the backyard and even further due to the light being off. A giant, monstrous Bigfoot stood there, just past the twisted fence, staring back at us. It suddenly moved closer as it took this tall thing merely 3 to 4 steps until it was within 10 yards or less of us at our window. Its head and shoulders went above our kitchen window, which was well off the ground. The top part I measured at 6 feet off the ground. This thing had to be, I realized later, at least 8.5 to 9 feet tall. Its eyes still reflected red, and brighter red this time, and it was showing teeth. Long, white, blocked teeth, I could tell. I cannot be sure of the color of this thing, even in the light, but I guess I would have to say dark brown or black. It took 2 more steps towards us, and that is when it slapped the back of the house. I thought at first, because of the loud sound it made, that it might have smashed the siding a bit. Later, I would see what I thought were knuckle prints, but the house was fine, just some dirt. My wife let out a squeak, Not a squeal, a squeak. She kept from screaming at that point. Just so you know, I was freaking out myself. We were now practically face to face with a monster. I was never a gun owner before, but after this night, I was. Its face was much clearer now, and it seemed very ape-like. Well, sort of, I guess. I think the only reason people who have seen this thing ascribe some sort of human likeness to it is because of its big round eyes and nose that may be smushed, but it's more human than ape for sure. My wife at that point moved closer to me and held on to me as if we were hanging from a cliff that led to oblivion below. I noticed as she moved that this thing could see clearly in the dark as its head and shoulders moved right at her as she moved. It was pitch black inside where we were at, and this thing watched as my wife literally moved over and clung to me. This told me that this thing could see clearly in the dark, and it knew we were there. It moved closer again, but this time it slapped the window, and that is when my wife let out a scream right in my ear. Another loud sound came at that moment as well. A gunshot. Howdy, neighbor. This thing moved like Michael Jordan on a basketball court, graceful, fast, and like it was born to it. Just then I heard a knock at my back sliding glass door. It was my neighbor, and he had a shotgun in his hand. I quickly calmed my wife and let him in. Apparently the animal moved from his house to ours using a kind of natural path made by deer and other animals like itself for some time now, to get back and forth between sections of the reservation and wildlife areas. He noticed it walking past his house that night. Minutes before, we watched as it came into our yard. He said it kept grunting, and that is what he did. He followed the grunts. I never heard any, but then again, we were indoors and pretty scared. He first told us he thought it was some person meandering back there in the wooded area. But what he said he saw was that night freaked him out, and he was glad he brought his gun. Of course, the shot rang out, and the other 3 neighbors we have out that way made their way over. We told them there was someone in our yard who smashed our fence down, but we kept it what it was to ourselves at that point. However, today, everybody knows. My one neighbor knows, though, and he said he was going to shoot it straight out once he saw it. But he couldn't. For some reason he said it was so human-looking that he simply shot over its head and watched as it ran off into the dark towards the river. The reservation and the riverman. It was not until almost Christmas that my wife had a chance to talk to the kids that mentioned the riverman and their moms. A meeting set up by her friend, the teacher, of course. They said it was something they did not talk about much, nor had their ancestors. It was to be avoided at all costs and was in fact dangerous. The conversation was not long, nor did they want to go into depth with anything other than the fact that this thing was and has been a part of their culture and history for as long as their tribe has been around. They did say, however, that it looked much like what I described to you here, only the color of hair was more reddish-brown usually. Some, of course, were different in color, but most seemed to be more reddish-brown. That told us there was more than one possibly out here right now. The fact we lived so close to the reservation and wild land made us start to consider the possibility of moving. After this incident, though, we never heard another thing. No screaming and no monsters entering our yard. We still live here today and have once had some, professionals come out and do a little investigating. But that was years ago, before the popularity of other groups like the BFRO and television shows. Other than that, like I said, we've had no further incidents. Even our neighbors stuck it out, and today is a very good friend I fish with and hunt with. And yes, when we do, it's always with one eye open and the stories shared of that night as we do. Thanks, Gilbert.